there is central control, where their votes would matter, where they would have some influence in how and when they are used, rather than the status quo whereby different nations with different leaders, with different personalities, possess these extremely destructive weaponry. Go ahead.
Sir, does the threat of mutually assured destruction controls the use of weapons in these countries?
But the problem with the threat of mutually assured destruction in the status quo is that it exists everywhere now, because of the fact that the weapons are spread around all these nations, Mr. Speaker. We believe that it is not necessary to have these weapons spread with Russia and Pakistan and India and China. We believe that the mutually assured destruction, which is Speaker, will be much significantly reduced if we have a central authority managing the majority of nuclear weapons that exist on the planet. My second argument, Mr. Speaker, is to show you that the UN will be more effective in management of these stockpiles than the countries that have them today. Mr. Speaker, we believe that the mandate that will be given to the UN in terms of reducing the stockpiles will first of all make them easier to manage. In terms of just sheer numbers, Mr. Speaker, today we have tens of thousands of weapons, Mr. Speaker. We do not see the necessity of these. One numbers closer to 300 would be easier manageable by the United Nations, Mr. Speaker. Also, the UN will have a mandate to keep these weapon systems up to date. Recently in the US, Mr. Speaker, there were surveys to show where the nuclear stockpiles of the United States are not being properly maintained. The computers which operate these systems are of the 1970s era, Mr. Speaker. The doors which close the silos that hold the nuclear weapons, the hinges don't work, Mr. Speaker. This is because the United States has no interest in maintaining these, because they are never going to be used, Mr. Speaker. We believe that this is bad. This is severely bad, Mr. Speaker. We believe that the United Nations, given funding and a mandate, will do a much better job of maintaining these stockpiles, Mr. Speaker. We also believe that there are less chances of nuclear weapons getting into the hands of terrorist groups and used incorrectly, Mr. Speaker. We look at countries like Pakistan, which now is in political upheaval with the opposition trying to throw out the government, Mr. Speaker. We do not believe that nations with unstable governments should be allowed to possess such powerful nuclear weapons, Mr. Speaker. We believe that a centralized system of nuclear weapon possession by the United Nations is much safer for the entire world, and it satisfies everybody's in terms of having the nuclear threat deterrent and safety at the same time, Mr. Speaker. Also, Mr. Speaker, we believe that the United Nations will be less influenced by political, religious, and other philosophies by which many countries use to determine when they go to war, Mr. Speaker. We do not believe that nuclear weapons will be launched, for example, for religious reasons, as has been threatened by Iran, Mr. Speaker, if they are controlled by the UN, Mr. Speaker. We believe that the United Nations is a much more responsible body, a much more inclusive body to control these weapons, to hold these weapons, to determine when these weapons are used, Mr. Speaker, and not what we have in the status quo, whereby nations all around the world possess hundreds, if not thousands, of nuclear weapons, Mr. Speaker, that can destroy the world, Mr. Speaker, and at any given time these countries can threaten each other, Mr. Speaker. We do not believe that the status quo satisfies the safety of all persons in the world, of all the countries that do not have weapons, Mr. Speaker. As such, we support the step that all the position that all countries should be, that the nuclear weapons should be given to the United Nations.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And now we invite the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. K.L. London, to respond to the government's case.
Pleasant good afternoon, Mr. Speaker, and to the other members in the House. I stand here as the opposition leader to emphasize that the opposition does not support the motion that all nuclear weapons should be given to the United Nations. But before I present my argument, allow me to comment on a few of the things the Prime Minister has said. Mr. Prime Minister, not being a part of the UN doesn't prevent the use of nuclear weapons. So by saying that you will prevent states or nations who do not submit their weapons to the UN, will not be a part of the UN, that does not in any way prevent them from using their weapons. Used by the UN or used by the nations, these weapons are still used. If you are advocating that the use of these weapons are so detrimental, whether it is used by Russia, by China, by the US, or it is used by the UN, it is still used and will have the same devastating impact on society. Further, the Security Council that you eloquently mentioned about, that is exactly what we are about to remind you. There is a Security Council put in place to make binding decisions that all of 190 plus countries of the UN are supposed to be binding by. What we need to do is use this Security Council to continue to mitigate any conflict that may arise between the nations instead of taking the weapons that gives us some sense of security and provide it to the UN. Let us use that same Security Council, if it means even attaching another panel to this council where they can monitor the use and the development of any nuclear weapon, then that is definitely a better solution, a better alternative than altogether making me as a nation be vulnerable by providing my nuclear weapons. Finally, you said that America don't even bother to maintain the quality of their war stuff because it is never going to be used. Exactly. The whole idea of having nuclear weapons is more of a threat. It's more of a bargaining chip. It's more of a last resort. For years and for decades, over 70 years, countries have been at heads with each other and there has been no nuclear strike. There has been no use because why? Both countries understand the importance, both countries understand the detriment to both their nations in the event that they use nuclear strike. Honorable judges, but on to the more substantive points that the opposition will make here today. First of all, I will speak on the sovereignty of a nation. I will speak of commitment by different nations to the UN. And finally, the deputy opposition leader will come in and touch on protection of citizens. Sovereignty. Every nation should be sovereign. In our constitutions, the highest law of the land says that we have the right to protect ourselves and our citizens. In China, Article 5. In the US, Article 4, subsection 4 of the Constitution gives them the right to protect against domestic and foreign invaders. How do I protect myself from persons who don't sign on to the UN and decide to use nuclear weapons against me? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to use the police force? Am I supposed to use pistols? Further, we have a constitutional right to defend ourselves, and the UN should not be forcing or encouraging that I surrender my sort of defense to you.
The fact that the United Nations will have these weapons means that the United States has influence in the United Nations and could dictate how these weapons will be used if they are ever threatened by a country such as North Korea, or want to satisfy your fears.
The United States may have influence, and the problem is 5 states. It's the UK, it's France, it's the US, it's Russia, and one other country who can veto the ruling of any other country. So at the end of the day, 5 nations out of an organization of 190 plus can decide, even if you don't want to use it, I will use it. So if I am not the United States and I don't want nuclear weapons to be used, they can decide, they can veto that decision. So at the end of the day, it is still in the hands of 5 people. It is still in the hands of people. Would you like to be in a room where you have your family, with all our families being protected, which is actually a very good example. And I say, well, let's all give our guns to this one person in the room, and then they will decide when it is used. And then there is an immediate threat against my family. And all 190 people have to first say, well, okay, let's pull the trigger to save his family. By the time they finish voting, my family will be dead. At the end of the day, I need to protect my family and ensure that it's best for them to live. Take your time. Finally, on my last point, Honorable Speaker, we have seen time and time again that countries who sign on to the UN do not commit to all the treaties as long as it does not further the agenda. Case in point, Canada pulled out from the drought treaty for whatever reason. China refused to participate in arbitration processes with the Philippines over territorial conflicts. Utah kept saying that they don't support the International Court of Justice because it goes against some of their constitutional rights and stuff like that. However, they are signed on to other aspects of the treaty. Who is to say that at whatever point I decide I'm going to up and get and decide I'm no longer part of this handing over my nuclear? Who is to say that I would even hand over all in the first place? Who is to say that I can't go back and prepare more and create more for use when I need to? There is no guarantee that we will commit to the United Nations. Because like he said, if we don't decide to commit, we also usually say, you are not a part of the UN, really. We have provided solutions, we have provided an alternative, and the impact here is civil peace and rest. We want our citizens to be secure. We want our citizens to have faith that we can defend them as the government in the unlikely event that we get into war with another nation. When we have that kind of faith, when we have that kind of confidence and assurance in our government, we will definitely have a happier and a peaceful society. Honorable judges, the opposition and the deputy will further this argument when we take the podium. I thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Leader of the Opposition. And now, Mr. Scott Mullings, the Deputy Prime Minister, will support the government's case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's certainly a pleasure of mine to be here and present to all of you on this very important topic. Now, the first thing we need to get clear is exactly what the Prime Minister announced before all of us is his model. A model that will determine how exactly this policy will operate in reality. Now, the fact is, the leader of the opposition seems to have not been listening carefully to the points clearly outlined by the Prime Minister. First thing, he made certain silly points. One was talking about having everybody vote. Now, the Prime Minister made it clear that there will be a special council deciding on what circumstances is appropriate to use nuclear weapons. Clearly missed that. No, this is not, of course, the UN Security Council as it stands. This is a separate council made up of representatives of the general UN body. These individuals we hold as responsible for making the critical decisions in moments that they are needed to be made. Clearly didn't understand at all what the Prime Minister was articulating. No, my job here is to further extend the arguments or further continue the argumentation, not accept this one, further continue the argumentation by offering a new substantive point. My new substantive point is simply this. There is superiority in international organizations responsible for dealing with security issues which affect us all, instead of leaving up to nations to decide how to deal with security issues which properly understood affect us all. Now, let me elaborate. First, the main purpose of the United Nations in the first place was setting it up, was to deal with international peace and international security, resolving issues relating to that. What we're talking about is giving to the UN the power which it already has in its mandate to deal with global security issues, which of course comes through when you talk about, you're not accepted, when you talk about nuclear weapons. As he pointed out in his argumentation, the Prime Minister, he spoke of how everybody is affected when a nuclear weapon is used. Clearly that's a global phenomenon. It's not something located with a particular nation. That's of global significance. Clearly, then the point is, if we are to think properly about how to effectively manage global security issues, we must prefer international organizations such as the UN, set up, formed.
What assurance do we have of this magical council? What competence? How will they even house these new weapons? Where?
Well, thank you very much for your question. Let me elaborate my arguments further and address that in due time. Now, let me deal again with the arguments as they have been established. First, if indeed these issues are global and international organizations already in place, why not prefer them? Why go along the line, not accepted, why go along the line of preferring nationalistic methods, which are clearly inferior? Why are they inferior? One, nationalistic approaches to security issues are very, very misconstrued. They generally misconstrue issues which are properly global. Take, for example, Saddam Hussein's use of biological weapons against the Kurds in the 80s. Now, he used these weapons against these individuals on the basis that, okay, he considered them a threat. But these weapons, of course, became vulnerable to terrorists to steal. Clearly, misconstruing based on his nationalistic ambitions was something that is truly of global significance and affects everyone across the globe. So clearly then, we find that using nationalistic approaches to dealing with security issues is flawed because, one, these individuals misconstrue issues which are properly global and deem them as purely nationalistic. Another reason, nationalistic approaches generally tend to be short-sighted when it comes to dealing with security issues. They generally like to think about the fact that here's a threat, how we're going to deal with it immediately and effectively. They don't think about the long-term consequences of their actions. They generally don't think about who else is being affected. They just focus on the fact that, okay, my family is going to be attacked. What am I going to do now? Emotional. Just completely off of impulse. No rational thought. No collaboration with other parties that's going to certainly be impacted by any critical decision of that kind. So once again, my argument is superiority is evident when you look at using international organizations that are already in place to deal with global security issues. You can't just rely on nations on their own to deal with these issues.
What role would the US play in all of this?
I'm not sure where that point is coming from, sir. The point we're making here is that we're not going to be relying on any particular nation to be making critical decisions. The point we're making here is that the UN overall is the responsible body to deal with all of these global issues properly. So once again, what was the argument put forward by the Prime Minister? What? Not accepted. The UN is more effective in managing these situations in relation to nuclear weapons. Not accepted. Managing these situations in terms of nuclear weapons. And also, every nation has a legitimate interest to ensure that nuclear weapons are managed protectly. And by virtue of that fact, the UN, an international body representing all nations, is far more democratic and far more responsive to that fact that all nations have a legitimate interest in how these issues are managed. And my argument is there's a superiority in using international organizations already in place to deal with global issues in relation to security than relying on nationalistic approaches that are generally short-sighted, misconstrued issues which are properly global and deem them as issues which only affect themselves, focusing on impulse. You have the family that's threatened, you generally don't think about anybody else who may be in danger when you use a weapon, you just think about protecting your family. Impulse, emotion. Nothing that we can rely on when we're dealing with nuclear weapons which affect every single soul when it's used.
Your main argument is the fact that there are international organs in place for that. Clearly they are not working. That's why other islands and nations are resorting to nuclear weapons. So
No. Thank you very much. They've not been working in the way that you're talking about because they've not been strengthened to the extent that we're claiming they ought to be strengthened. The UN is not strengthened to the point where it's controlling nuclear weapons. It's not strengthened to the point where it's dealing with these issues which it should probably be dealing with due to the fact that it has a mandate to deal with all concerns which affect international peace and security. His model is simply to rely on the way as it is now, the Security Council as it is now. Individuals still operating out of their nationalistic impulse, such as the US, etc., and not dealing with the global issues which affect us all. So with that said, Mr. Speaker, it's clear based on our argumentation that we have demonstrated clearly that our side is superior, which is all we need to establish the win this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. And now we ask the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to support the case for the Opposition. Mr. Sambor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This House would give all nuclear weapons to the UN, is what the government is purporting. But we do not agree with that. We say that the UN, true, it is a global group, but it is a flawed global group. And we do not feel that that flawed global group should have greater power. Look at what the UN has achieved, even without nuclear weapons. Has the UN not forced Iran to the table time and time again? And has it needed nuclear weapons to do so? No, it hasn't. Does the UN not have a Security Council which is responsible for resolving, looking into global conflict and ways of resolving that? Yes, it does. So why not strengthen that Security Council as opposed to strengthening the arsenal of an organization who we do not feel may be able to manage that arsenal properly? Now, the opposition leader stated why giving nuclear weapons to the UN is against the sovereignty of nations. I want to bring to the table an additional point that giving all these weapons to the UN is not going to allow countries to protect their citizens. I'll take your point of information now.
The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred under the status quo, which obviously your side is proposing. It would be agree that my model that the government is proposing would eliminate things like that happening or almost happening.
No, sir, I do not believe so. And do you know why I do not believe so and why you, Mr. Speaker, should not believe so? Because when have we seen nuclear weapons used? 70 years ago. That was the first time that nuclear weapons were used in war. And in case the government is not aware, I should say, and I should underscore, the only time that nuclear weapons were used. So it shows that the world understands the ramifications of using nuclear weapons. Did the United States not, after the horrors, after seeing the horrors of that bombing of Japan, that it supported, that it caused, did the US not move to form the United Nations, to find other ways to resolve conflict? The US, yes, created the atomic bomb and thought this is great, it can end wars like that. And so they used it, but then they saw no, this has great potential for destroying humanity. And so we need an alternative, the UN. And that is why we feel that we should not contradict the reason for forming the UN by padding it with nuclear weapons, but we should strengthen its negotiating ability by strengthening the Security Council and allowing for formation of a panel to monitor the production and the use of nuclear weapons. That we feel is the right way to go. Why? Because that allows countries to protect their citizens. The opposition leader said, and he said, and I repeat for your benefit, that it allows countries to protect their sovereignty. It also allows them to protect their citizens. How so? Let us consider countries like Iran and North Korea. True, they've got under the skin of the global population, right? But have they been invaded? Have their citizens been attacked? No, and why not? Because the world knows, if we go into Korea, they have some serious weapons there and they could retaliate. So the nuclear weapons are a bargaining chip for these countries, a bargaining chip for them to maintain the peace that exists in their country and for them to protect their citizens. To give all of it to the United Nations is to say, we are taking away your defense, we are taking away your ability to protect your citizens. Go ahead.
Are you positing, sir, that Iran and North Korea, these violent countries, should possess these weapons so that they can use them as bargaining chips to force Western democracies to do certain things?
Certainly not, sir. I am showing that those weapons are preventing certain drastic action, like invasion, and they are forcing the world to go to a calmer way of a more diplomatic way of resolving issues by forcing Iran to come to the table instead of invading Iran like was done in Iraq, invading Iran and destroying the government system that is there, leaving the country in shambles. Now, that brings me to my second point, that when you protect your citizens, you don't just protect them from death. You don't just protect your citizens, the lives of your citizens, but you also protect the livelihood of your citizens. Let us consider Russia. Let us consider Tatiana Tushenko preparing for the Olympics, rhythmic gymnast, and she loves this thing. When Russia doesn't have the ability to protect Tatiana Tushenko's life and her livelihood, how is she going to see, how is she going to reach that self-actualization? How is she going to continue on and achieve her goals? Imagine if we didn't live in Jamaica, if we lived in North Korea, and albeit that as different as it is from Jamaica, but imagine if you lived in a country where you didn't have the assurance of being able to complete your degree. You started today, but you're not sure whether you're going to sleep tomorrow. Why? Because there's a country that is oppressing yours and that is threatening to invade yours and to impose their livelihood and their way of life on you. And that is what would happen if we take away the nuclear weapon, which the countries have shown that they do not intend to use. For over 70 years, there have been nuclear weapons in the world. There have been conflicts in the world. There have been flaring up and settling down of all sorts of violent groups, etc. But have they used nuclear weapons? No. And so the nuclear weapon that the country possesses is a bargaining chip to ensure that they have a secure livelihood for their people, that they're able to ensure that their people continue on living life as they want to live it, not as some other country would want them to, some other country that is hell-bent on invading and imposing their way on those people. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge you to remember those points and to consider those points again, that giving all the weapons to the United Nations is putting all the weapons, taking away the sovereignty of countries, taking away the ability of countries to protect their people. Think about your livelihood, Mr. Speaker, and the livelihood of all the people in this nation. Do you not want it protected? Do you not want it to be secure? Thank you.
That concludes the opening house, and now we go to the closing house and start with the member for the government, Ms. Shannon Stevenson. Ms. Stevenson will extend the case for the government.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will first start on my points of rebuttal. Now, the leader of the opposition spoke about giving powers to only 5 persons. Now, in a democracy, this is the same thing we do every election. Every election season, we elect persons to the government, and we charge them with the responsibility of carrying out the citizens who elect them best interest at heart. Now, my Prime Minister spoke to setting up councils and reducing the stock to a manageable amount. What stock are we talking about? Now, this is a stock of nuclear weapons with which we would charge the United Nations with control and distribution. The deputy opposition leader spoke to UN being a flawed group. A flawed group, ladies and gentlemen. Now, how can a group work without support? Look at your chairs. Does it have legs? That's support. Every group, if it ought to be effective, it needs support. What the proposition is proposing today is give the UN a chance to be effective, give the UN a chance to effectively operate. Now, my first substantive point would be not accepted. My first substantive point would be that the UN is a collectively trusted force. Hence, it will promote proper control and distribution of these weapons. How, you might ask? It lessens corruption through the said checks and balances, which my Prime Minister spoke about in the setting up of these councils. It will also lessen arbitrary use of power, which ties into the very mandate of the United Nations, which is to, not at this time, which is to perform peacekeeping and humanitarian tasks. No other group to date has been able to perform these very hard tasks. What is the goal of the UN? Okay, what is the essential purpose of the United Nations? It is to provide essential services like food, shelter, and other services to persons who are displaced by war and natural disasters. Much needed health care is also one of these. Look at the successes. The opposition talked about flawed group. Look at the successes of the United Nations. With the end to apartheid, the end to the mass spreading of AIDS and other diseases. Hence, the UN is one of the most trusted international bodies, the most legitimate bodies to control the distribution and further use of such weaponry. The use of nuclear weapons affects not only the manufacturers, but the neighboring countries in areas such as health and integration and overall human welfare. The UN is not a strong supporter of war. Therefore, it is most likely that they will do everything in their power to keep fighting as a last resort. The US's President, George W. Bush, criticized the UN for failing to support the American invasion of Iraq. Everybody remembers that, right? No, this was claimed to be prompted by Iraq's defiance of the very UN mandate regarding weapons of mass destruction and the impact it had on human life. In this situation, it should be highlighted that the removal of such the monstrous master, Mr. Saddam Hussein himself, claimed more innocent lives than the actual tyranny that was reflected in the media. Iraq is only a single act of a larger drama. The proposition is not alluding that citizens sit back and relax and allow injustice to happen. We are saying in this age, what is most needed is structure and organization. What is most needed is structure and organization, rather than imperialism. It is essential. Taken.
Don't you think that this new power of controlling such great weapons will continue and perpetuate? Do you not think that this new power that they have by having so much nuclear weapon will actually give them the power to be more imperialistic?
Thank you so much for that point, sir. No, the model presented by my Prime Minister clearly stated setting up councils and reducing, did I say reducing? Reducing the nuclear stock to a manageable amount. Who would decide what is a management? It is a collective decision. It is a collective decision on the members of the council. So yes, they are given a bigger responsibility. Yes, it is possible that corruption might be a result. However, there are checks and balances in place. And if you are a realistic person, you will realize that we don't live in a utopic society. It is possible, everything is possible. But what we are saying is, in introducing and in charging the United Nations with such a great responsibility, it is far less likely, and with checks and balances, it is far less likely for such things to happen. It is essentially giving the power to a trusted source. The implication on overall human life is what is at hand, right? And the proposition rests on this case, on this note. Give the UN a chance to help overall humanity. I thank you.
Thank you, Governor Member. And now we invite Mr. Andre Samuels, the member for the opposition, to extend the opposition's case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, fundamentally, the opposition has a lot of problem with what was supposed to be a model, what was supposed to be argument supporting another model, and so we're going to cite these today. So first we hear about this magical council that is going to be automatically competent, because that's what we have to assume, because we didn't hear that it's going to be made up of persons of the highest capacities, whatever those capacities may be. We didn't hear whether or not these persons will be properly regulated. We didn't hear how the decisions to actually use these weapons is going to be made. And let's just say we hear something coming out about how the United States will have an interest in maintaining these. To the extent that the United States is spending their money to maintain these weapons, we will assume that they will now have new powers over these weapons because, hey, people pays the piper calls the tune. And we believe that this is a part of the problem. The reality is that the first country that had nuclear weapons is the one that taught us that we should never use them again. That was the United States. I don't think we want to go back there. Now we're going to talk about exactly what happens when somebody in the P5, the big guys, the really big guys, decide to say, hey, China says, guess what, I'm not giving you my nuclear weapons. Russia says, no, no, for you to come and tell me that I can't go in Ukraine, what is going to happen then? We're going to kick them out of the UN. Remember the power that these countries have in the UN. I hope you consider that when you are putting together your model. Now, secondly, we want to talk about exactly how we speak of this United Nations as being the saving grace. Yet 3 years on and more, we still have the crisis in Syria. How do you say to me how competent the United Nations is in dealing with diplomatic issues that happen within and between nations when we still have the crisis that is happening? How is it that the Ukraine-Russia crisis cannot be solved by the United Nations if they are so great and competent at doing all they can? So we hear you keep speaking about how great this United Nations is, but the evidence does not support what you are trying to put into our heads.
On that point,
go ahead.
Are you then saying that some nations, such as Pakistan, with an unstable government, is vastly superior to the United Nations?
Thank you. It is because Pakistan has nuclear weapons and India has nuclear weapons, while either country has not wiped out the other over the battle that they have in the Kashmir region. This is the prevention that we are trying to reduce. Now we hear from the member a while ago a lot of love to say that, okay, we will ensure that this council will ensure no more wars. We don't actually know how. We're still trying to figure that out. But we hope they'll think about it some more. Now, we hear that the UN is trusted. We hear that we can really give up our power to control and defend our nation to somebody that is going to store these weapons somewhere we don't know, because remember, the UN is not a country. We don't know where they will be hosted, they'll be held. Now, let's deal with also the problem of transportation, because they didn't deal with that. Wherever we are bringing them, from India, from Pakistan to somewhere, what happens when a terrorist attack happens on that ship that is carrying them because they can't go by air? So all of those things we have to consider, because the possibility of an attack means, therefore, that they can get into the wrong hands. And that is something that we do not want. The possibility exists that there can be accidents, and that is going to create the same disaster that we're trying to prevent, that of which you speak of. Not at this time. No, it's my first substantive. Now, we didn't hear them speak about as to exactly why is it that we want to entrust a council that they're going to set up of whoever is going to make it up with such great powers. Because it is easy to have UNESCO dealing with education, health and everything, but it's another thing to give them weapons that can destroy the entire world, or to give somebody weapons that can destroy the entire world and say, oh, they're not going to be corrupt because we have checks and balances. That's what she said. You know, so here's a part of the problem. Go ahead.
Do we not hold your government accountable? Should we not hold the UN accountable?
Thank you. The problem is, you know, that after 5 years I can vote them out. I cannot vote out the UN. That's a part of the problem. I have control over my government. Now, we're going to talk about a little bit more about how dangerous this power can be. Because this council can become very, very corrupt. Because the constitution of this council is going to be individuals that whoever favors that they go on the council, who will defend their own interests, go on said council. So the decision to actually use those weapons is going to be influenced by the persons who put you there. And that's a risk that we do not want to run with such things as nuclear weapons. This is mutually assured destruction. The reality is that if it is that if Pakistan and India give these two some group that decides to use them, or let's say for argument's sake there is an accident or something happened, the mutually assured destruction is the total wipeout of humanity. This is how great these things are. What Pakistan and India have that prevent the war between them can wipe out humanity. That is the reason there is not a war between both countries. That's the reason the Cold War period was so important. That's the reason since that period all we've really had is Cold Wars and more Cold Wars. And if we remove these from these countries, what we're going to do is revert to the age where we have countries going back to war to say, to the extent that I have more power and language missiles than you, I can bomb you and kill some of your people. That's not going to affect me. You don't have any nuclear weapons. So we can easily go back to the war culture that we had. This is too much of a great risk that we believe. Now, secondly, we want to talk about the issue as to how exactly this is a backward step that we don't want to go into. Nuclear weapons, as much as we would not like to believe, represent a symbol of peace maintenance. To the extent that the US and Russia went very close to nuclear warfare, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which he nicely spoke about. They went close, but they did not have a war because of the threat of mutually assured destruction. The reality is that if I can destroy you and you can destroy me, we're not going to fight. We're going to stay out of each other's way and deal with our differences diplomatically. That's what nuclear weapons has actually brought to us. This is something that we're going to step back from if it is that we are supposed to remove them from the nations that actually have them. And this is a part of what we don't have. Let's just say we take them from Israel. And when they're in the Middle East, or the threat of Iran and the fighting against Palestine, they have very little power there. So these are some of the problems that we want to mitigate. So, Mr. Speaker, we believe that the status quo is working. We don't want to move to total power in one individual's hands. We do not want to have a backward step in the progress that we're making where wars are concerned. And for that reason, we proudly oppose.
Thank you, opposition member. And now it is the turn of the government whip, Mr. Javon Minto, to summarize and conclude the case for the government.
Mr. Speaker, members of the House, good afternoon. This evening we're here debating the motion this House would give all nuclear weapons to the United Nations. Mr. Speaker, the debate started out on the basis from the government that we are willing to give all nuclear weapons to the United Nations under the guise of the fact that the UN is a legitimate international organization and under the banner that we are willing to protect world interests, Mr. Speaker. The opposition came up here, Mr. Speaker, and they basically refuted all the arguments that were proposed by saying that they favor a nationalistic interest over international interests, Mr. Speaker. I want for the opposition to point out one world war, one world crisis that has ever taken place that was not motivated by nationalistic interests, Mr. Speaker. And on that basis, that's exactly why we want the United Nations to be in charge of all nuclear weapons that all members, all countries of this world are in possession of, Mr. Speaker. The model proposed by the government was for a new charter to be ratified at the UN. We also saying that, Mr. Speaker, that the UN would be dictating the usage of the weapons. We are also saying that we would withhold memberships from countries that failed to sign on, Mr. Speaker. Exactly why this is a good proposal, let's examine, Mr. Speaker. Regardless of the fact that at this point in time, no country has committed to the UN to hand over their nuclear weapon, that doesn't mean that they are not going to use the nuclear weapon, Mr. Speaker. And when we ratify this new charter, asking for countries to commit, Mr. Speaker, to commit join on to the UN, then there's a greater chance that international and global devastation will be reduced, Mr. Speaker, and that's exactly what we're fighting against. Accept it.
The countries have had nuclear weapons for quite some time, and they haven't used it. Isn't that an indication that they do not intend to use it?
I thank you very much.
Threat from
it's not a matter of intention, Mr. Speaker. We're looking at an even-if situation. Further down the road, Mr. Speaker, we do not want any possibility of a global devastation to happen. The government came up here, Mr. Speaker, and we said that, oh my God, what is going to happen in case India and Pakistan goes to war? It's not a matter of only India and Pakistan, Mr. Speaker. It's about countries that are in the surrounding region, Mr. Speaker, that are also going to be affected. So we're saying, in the name of an international legitimate organization such as the United Nations, we're going to move ahead, move forward, ratify a new charter, and take away all nuclear weapons from them, Mr. Speaker. I want for the opposition to also answer whether or not they would favor a council over a country to be in charge of nuclear weapons, because that's exactly, not accepted at this time, that's exactly what the opposition member came up here and proposed, that they prefer for countries to have their nuclear weapons over for a global body, world-recognized body such as the UN, to be in control, Mr. Speaker. The deputy opposition leader came up here, Mr. Speaker, and he referred to the United Nations as a flawed group. And he pointed to Iran and what's going on with the UN trying for Iran to not use its nuclear weapons, Mr. Speaker. Again, that's exactly why we're moving forward for the UN to be in control. Because at this point in time, the UN is dealing with Iran, the UN Council and so forth is dealing with Iran for Iran to pass on their nuclear weapons and all of that, Mr. Speaker. Accept it.
Now you mentioned that countries will oversee the operation of the United States. Are the members of countries not members of the country which can include
I thank you very much. But when there's a process, Mr. Speaker, for a council to decide over the usage of nuclear weapons, we're not talking about sarin gas anymore, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about nuclear weapons that pose a threat to destroy the entire globe, Mr. Speaker. So we're saying we favor, of course, a council to be in charge of all nuclear weapons that this world has, Mr. Speaker. He also mentioned that nuclear weapons possessed by countries will seek to prevent invasion and rather favors democracy. But that's not the point, Mr. Speaker. There is no way that a country is going to invade another country unless that country is in some gross breaches of human rights atrocities, Mr. Speaker. And that's exactly, again, why we're going to use the United Nations to ensure that when any country that decides to invade, for example, Syria or Iraq, Mr. Speaker, to prevent the government from committing human rights atrocities against its people, we don't want them to have nuclear weapons to launch against the country that attempts to invade them. And when they do that, not only are the regional countries going to be affected, but again, it poses a threat for global destruction, Mr. Speaker. Accept it.
Yes, sir. Please tell us how your Prime Minister's model ensure us, give us an assurance that there will be no nuclear weapons if some countries decide to opt out of this new deal and not be a part of the UN.
Mr. Speaker, we are not saying that there will be no nuclear weapon, because the status quo that currently exists is that every country has its own nuclear weapon, not controlled by any international organization. And we're simply saying, if you use a council to control these nuclear weapons, it's a great likelihood that for a global war, when a global warfare breaks out, and Iran sides with Russia, and for China to side with Russia, France with the US, and Britain with the US, then Mr. Speaker, when the UN controls most of these nuclear weapons by these countries, then the likelihood of a global devastation is drastically reduced. And as a position, I would expect that we do not want for the world to go back to any period such as when the Cold War, when nations were choosing allies and taking sides, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly why we're going to move forward, Mr. Speaker. I want to reiterate one thing, Mr. Speaker, that the United Nations is the most trusted, legitimate body to take control of nuclear weapons. It is fitted and equipped and structured enough to organize and distribute the nuclear weapons at any point in time when they're needed. But we are removing the possibility of national interest motivating the use of nuclear weapons by any other country, Mr. Speaker. Imperialistic nations condemn the UN Security Council for failing to bless the second Gulf War. It's the very same thing that America did when the UN did not bless the Iraqi invasion. It's all about national interest, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're mitigating against. That's a government case. We want for a global interest to be recognized by all countries and not for a national interest. If you want to restore legitimacy, you must subject yourself to it. That's what we're saying as a government. I
The government whip has spoken, and now the final speaker, the opposition whip, Mr. Charles Frost, will summarize and conclude the case for the opposition and indeed to conclude the entire debate.
Pleasant day, honorable onlookers, Mr. Speaker, and those distinguished members of the platform. The debate has been interesting thus far. I am enjoying it. It is very good. I am not sure how much I can further the entertainment, but I will try my best. Now, the debate from both sides, we saw strong arguments popping up here and there. And what I have come to observe is that this debate is boiling down to two significant questions that we must answer. And these two questions, the person that gives the better answer is the person who will walk away the victor. The first question that we have to ask is our world safer with all the nuclear bombs, all the nuclear weaponry centralized in one location? The other question that we must ask is how competent, how capable is the United Nations in managing the centralization of these nuclear weapons? Very good. Now, let's fire things up a little. The Prime Minister came, Mr. Prime Minister. Too loud? Very good. The Prime Minister came, the opening government came, and we see where they have been subscribing to what I would describe as a philosophical misconstruction. You have set a fallacious foundation because on one hand, you're saying that we want to centralize the nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, you're saying that we are going to allow countries to keep it if they want. So what we are seeing, there has not been the highlighting of any sort of incentive in giving up your nuclear weapon. Furthermore, there are still many questions left to be answered. The question of the cost. We can't assume that money is infinite. To secure a facility that has all the world's nuclear weapons, or most of it, is going to be at a tremendous cost. Who will put the cost? These people are speaking of the United Nations as if the United Nations is a country, as if the United Nations is an economy. The United Nations is a corporation, right? And there are always disagreements between, not accepted. There are always disagreements between the respective entities within the corporation. Nobody has taken it.
That's why we're saying the UN should be in control of all the world's nuclear weapons to prevent against nationalism.
Oh my word, what have you just said? You are talking about giving absolute control to the United Nations. You are talking about giving absolute power to the United Nations. Have you not heard that where there is absolute power, you give absolute power, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what is going to happen? We are going to find that the face of the United Nations is going to transform. No, it is the epitome of harmony and peace and standing up for the great ethos and ethics of life. But guess what? Give it absolute power and things are different. On that point. Not known for you, sir. As we continue the debate and we saw it progress from upper house on both sides and lower house on both sides, you and I can agree that the opposition's position really became a nightmare in the face of government when government member came and stunned them. Opposition member, very good. We are the next government, so I'm speaking to the people. Opposition member came and he expressed some very salient points. Let me find them and talk to them for you, Mr. Government as well. So, we are going to be making a backward step. That is what your policy, that is what your model is moving towards, encouraging a backward step.
As my general mentioned, not accepted, as my general mentioned, what is causing the peace right now is that MAD, mutually assured destruction. So because you know, right, because you know that I have nuclear and you have nuclear, you are going to be more hesitant to attack me. Because if I attack you and you are wiped out, or partially wiped out, you are going to attack me and wipe me out. And so things won't work out very pleasantly for the future of humanity. Let me tell you something. There is also too big a risk. Not accepted, sir. I don't give another person a chance. There is also a great risk, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Mr. Speaker. There is a tremendous risk. There are persistent Thank you very much, thank you very much. I get your point. I get your point, I get your point. Before the advent of nuclear war or nuclear weapons, there were many more wars. There were wars every day. People would drop bombs every day. People would go into battlefield activity on a daily basis. Why? Because the impact of war was not so significant and they understood that. Now with the advent of nuclear weapons, we see that war is on the decline. People have been forced to use the diplomatic channel because they understand that nuclear weapon is serious business. As my government member came and pointed out, there is a great risk. There is too great a risk. And that risk lies in the transportation of these things. And wonderful. Just to wrap up. They spoke about, I have 20 seconds to wrap, right? They spoke about, time is flying very fast. They spoke about the idea of less chance of terrorist control of nuclear activity. When you go and disrupt nuclear activity and try to transport them, you have increased the chance of it getting into the hands of terrorists. So we stand resolute that we should not hand over nuclear weapons to the United States. Thank you very much.
Now, who said that debating wasn't a sport and that debating was fun? We have an answer. Thank you very much, Opposition Whip. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the speaking part of the debate. Now we ask the members of the floor to come.